On July 13 in Bloomfield, a young cow ran away from Saba Live Poultry, a meat shop that advertises itself as halal. Employees chased the cow all the way into the parking lot of a nearby Home Depot. But here's where things get a little bit weird. A man who was not an employee of the meat shop, but who was contracted to build an expansion onto the meat shop, attempted to shoot the cow with a bow and arrow, but missed and instead struck the back wall of the Home Depot. I guess he just happened to have a bow and arrow on hand at the time. And when actual employees caught the cow, they proceeded to slit its throat in the Home Depot parking lot, and it was all caught on camera by police. This prompted an investigation into Saba Live Poultry, which found that the ceilings had feathers, fat, and filth hanging over processing tables, the facility had no hot water, butchering utensils were not properly sanitized or stored, contact surfaces for meat were unclean, and the shop's bandsaw had an accumulation of fat and bone under its cover. The inside temperatures were also between 29 to 32 Celsius, which is like 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with no air conditioning and no ventilation. Saba Live Poultry was temporarily shut down to address these issues. PETA erected a billboard near the Home Depot, and local animal rights groups held a vigil, which itself got a little bit weird. A man who had appeared to be one of the vigil goers took to his megaphone to mock the death of the calf. The man pulled out a hamburger and ate it in front of the group. But last week, the story took another disturbing turn. On the morning of August 7, "Cease with the needless slaughter" and "Muslims go home" was found graffitied onto the building of Saba Live Poultry. And while the hate speech vandalism may have rightfully shocked many in Connecticut, it was pretty tame compared to a lot of the anti-Muslim comments about the meat shop that can be found online. Now, to be clear, to call Saba Live Poultry poorly managed would be a tremendous understatement. That's undisputed. But this sort of bigotry should not be tolerated. And while graffitiing anti-Muslim hate speech is of course never acceptable, it's particularly ludicrous in this case, considering that the main customers of halal meat shops are Muslims themselves. Given all this news related to an unscrupulous meat shop that advertised itself to Muslim clientele, local media outlets have had to talk about halal food in a negative context without giving much background information. And although halal food is increasingly popular outside of strictly Muslim circles, it's quite understandable that not everyone has a clear idea of what it means. So I reached out to the Muslim Coalition of Connecticut, who put me in touch with Refai Arefin, a lawyer and imam at the Islamic Association of Greater Hartford, which is located in Berlin. But before I play part of the interview, I want to be clear about my intentions. Far too often, Muslims are called upon to apologize for or explain the misdeeds that other Muslims may have committed. That's clearly unfair, and frankly, that's bad journalism. Our interview stuck to mostly discussing what exactly halal is. Imam Arefin wasn't there to speak for all Muslims, but rather to help give some context to what halal is.
So the word halal means permissible. And in order to understand halal, you have to go back to the traditions that preceded the Islamic rules, so Judeo-Christian principles. In fact, a common theme throughout prophethood is that although there are a multitude of animals, there are certain animals and certain ways of eating which God has made permissible for human beings to partake in, and that there are certain categories of food which are not permissible. So halal indicates the ruling in terms of whether it's permissible or not. So for example, there's certain categories of meat which are not halal, pork being the most famous. But then there's also meat which by religious virtue is not permissible. So for example, if somebody were to trap or torture an animal, trapping in Islam is considered a form of torture of the animal because the animal doesn't die an immediate death. That would also not be permissible to eat.
While halal is typically associated with food, that's not all it's limited to.
So it's like what we said in the beginning, that halal is a legal category of something being permissible. So for example, in Islam, the consumption of alcohol is not halal, it's haram. It is something which is prohibited, right? And then there are other things which which would, which are halal or haram, they fall in either category of being permissible or not permissible, and that have nothing to do with food.
Imam Arefin told me that it is easy to draw comparisons between Islam's halal food and Judaism's kosher food, but that they are not exactly the same.
There isn't a large degree of difference between kosher and halal. In fact, I would say that kosher includes all the requirements of halal, plus a few extra. And that's the best way to understand it. So, as a Muslim, I eat kosher, and that satisfies all of the religious requirements. And that's because in the 4th chapter of the Quran, the 5th chapter of the Quran, there's a verse that says that the food of Christians and Jews are permissible. But kosher is an even wider concept. So, for example, if you have kosher meat, you still need to make sure your other cutlery, your other items are also kept in a way which is where the kosher environment is maintained. Whereas Muslims generally would be far more lax about that. And that's why you'll see Jews who keep kosher typically wouldn't go to mainstream restaurants, whereas most Muslims do.
As I mentioned before, we did not talk about the specifics of the Saba live poultry case, but we did talk about ideal halal abattoirs.
Well, I think we don't have to look that far. We have great models, particularly in New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Many of those halal companies are located in Canada, in Ontario, Canada. I've been to many of them, and you find very clean, sanitary, hygienic facilities. You'll find farm areas, right? Most of these are located in farm areas in which the animals are free. They eat a very healthy, mixed diet, which they're supposed to be having instead of just corn, for example. And then you'll have a separate facility where they're shifted at the time of butchery, right? Rather than being held, basically, where the animals are aware of what's happening, and then they get transported to another area, and you'll find that even though it's a large facility, one animal is processed at a time, and the animal is secured and safe, and then the person who is actually conducting the sacrifice then comes and does it in a single motion, and somebody who's very professional. And then the facilities it's a tiled room in which the animal is then hung and the blood is drained, and there are water jets that automatically clean that facility, and then it's taken down the line, and the meat is prepared, and then the next animal is processed.
The Saba live poultry case is a sad one. Sad for the animals who were victimized, sad for the customers who consumed potentially unclean meat, and sad for the Muslims unfairly targeted by hate speech. But despite how sad the impetus for our interview was, the optimism of Imam Refai Arefin was palpable.
Democracy only works if you have a free exchange of ideas, if you have freedom of speech, if you have freedom of expression, if you have freedom of religion. Otherwise, it's just a procedure. It's when people can voice opposition to mainstream thinking, to whichever party happens to be in the majority. That's true democracy. And I wish, as an American Muslim, I think that's an important message that we need to send the rest of the world, which is that I've been to over 30 countries. I've been to more than 20 Muslim majority countries. And with confidence, everywhere I go, I tell them, I say, America is the best country for a Muslim to live in, because we practice our religion freely and without any interference, and no one dictates how we should practice our religion. I wish they were able to do the same, and I hope that as democracy spreads, that they enjoy the same kind of freedoms that we have here.